The autumn wind swept across the Pine Ridge Reservation in South Dakota, carrying with it the scent of burning sage and the distant sound of drums that seemed to echo from the very soul of the land. Sarah Thompson pulled her oversized cardigan tighter around her shoulders as she walked through the dusty parking lot of the tribal community center, her footsteps crunching on fallen leaves that had turned the color of rust and gold. At 23, Sarah had grown accustomed to the way conversations stopped when she entered a room, how eyes would flicker over her body with barely concealed judgment before looking away. Standing at 5'6" and weighing nearly 300 pounds, she had learned to navigate the world by making herself as invisible as possible, despite her frame making that an impossible task. "Are you sure you want to go in there?" asked Marcus, her younger brother, as he adjusted his wire-rimmed glasses and glanced toward the community center's entrance. The sound of traditional drums grew louder, accompanied by the rhythmic shuffle of feet and the occasional whoop of celebration. "I mean, you don't have to put yourself through this." Sarah's jaw tightened. Marcus meant well, but his protective instincts often felt more like imprisonment. "I'm a journalist, Marcus. This is my job. The Rapid City Journal sent me to cover the powwow, and that's exactly what I'm going to do." The truth was more complicated. Sarah had specifically requested this assignment, driven by a deep fascination with Native American culture that had begun in college. She had spent months researching the traditions, the history, and the contemporary challenges facing the Lakota people. But more than professional curiosity, she felt drawn to their stories of resilience, their connection to the land, and their emphasis on community over individual achievement. Inside the community center, the atmosphere was electric. The large gymnasium had been transformed into a sacred space, with colorful banners hanging from the ceiling and folding chairs arranged in concentric circles around a central area where dancers moved in time to the hypnotic beat of drums. The air was thick with the smell of fry bread and burning sweetgrass, and Sarah could feel the weight of centuries-old traditions pressing down on her shoulders. She found a seat in the back, pulling out her notebook and trying to blend into the background. But even here, in this space dedicated to celebrating heritage and tradition, she could feel the familiar prickle of awareness that came with being the largest person in the room. A group of teenage girls near the front kept glancing back at her, their whispered conversations punctuated by barely concealed giggles. "Look at her," one of them said, not quite quietly enough. "She's so big she probably can't even get up and dance." Sarah's pen stopped moving across the page. She had heard worse, much worse, but something about being mocked in this sacred space felt particularly cruel. She forced herself to focus on the dancers, on the stories being told through movement and song, on the way the elderly drummers' faces seemed to glow with an inner light as they played. At the center of the circle, the dancers moved with a grace that seemed to defy gravity. Men in elaborate headdresses and women in intricately beaded dresses told stories with their bodies, their feet keeping perfect time with the drums. Sarah found herself mesmerized by the way they moved, by the way their dancing seemed to connect them to something larger than themselves. "First time at a powwow?" asked a gentle voice beside her. Sarah turned to see an elderly Lakota woman settling into the chair next to her. The woman's face was deeply lined, her silver hair braided with colorful ribbons, and her eyes held a warmth that immediately put Sarah at ease. "Yes," Sarah replied, closing her notebook. "I'm Sarah Thompson, from the Rapid City Journal. I'm here to write about the powwow." The woman nodded thoughtfully. "I'm Eleanor Crow Feather. My grandson is one of the dancers." She gestured toward the circle, where a young man in traditional regalia was performing what appeared to be a story dance. "That's Joseph. He's been dancing since he could walk." Sarah followed Eleanor's gaze to the young man. He was tall and lean, with long black hair that moved like water as he danced. His movements were fluid and precise, each step deliberate and meaningful. Unlike the other dancers, he seemed to dance not for the crowd, but for himself, as if the music was coming from somewhere deep inside him. "He's incredible," Sarah said, genuinely impressed. Eleanor smiled. "He's always been special. Lost his parents when he was 12, came to live with me. Dancing helped him find his way back to himself." She paused, studying Sarah's face. "You know, there's a story our people tell about the first powwow. It wasn't about showing off or competing. It was about community, about everyone having a place in the circle." Before Sarah could respond, a commotion erupted near the front of the room. The teenage girls who had been whispering earlier had grown bolder, their voices carrying across the space. "Can you imagine if she tried to dance?" one of them said, pointing directly at Sarah. "She'd probably break the floor." The laughter that followed was sharp and cruel, cutting through the sacred atmosphere like a knife. Sarah felt her face burn with shame and anger. She started to stand, ready to flee, when Eleanor's gentle hand touched her arm. "Don't let them steal your spirit," the older woman said quietly. "Some people only know how to tear down because they've forgotten how to build up." But the damage was done. Sarah could feel the eyes of the entire room on her now, some sympathetic, others curious, a few openly hostile. The beautiful music that had entranced her moments before now seemed to mock her presence. She was an outsider, a white woman in a native space, and worse, she was fat in a world that seemed to worship physical perfection. The drums stopped suddenly, and in the silence that followed, Sarah's rapid breathing seemed unnaturally loud. She looked around desperately for an exit, for some way to escape the humiliation that was crushing down on her like a physical weight. That's when she saw him. Joseph Crowfeather stood at the edge of the dance circle, his chest rising and falling from the exertion of dancing. His dark eyes were fixed on Sarah, but unlike the other stares she had endured, his gaze held no judgment, no mockery. Instead, there was something else there, recognition perhaps, or understanding. Without breaking eye contact, Joseph began to walk toward her. The crowd parted before him, conversations dying away as people sensed something significant was about to happen. Sarah's heart pounded so hard she was certain everyone could hear it. He stopped directly in front of her, close enough that she could see the intricate beadwork on his chest plate, smell the sage smoke that clung to his hair. For a long moment, they simply looked at each other. Then, to Sarah's complete shock, Joseph extended his hand toward her. "What are you doing?" she whispered, her voice barely audible. Joseph didn't speak. Instead, he simply held his hand steady, waiting. Behind him, the drummers began a slow, gentle rhythm, as if they understood something that the rest of the room didn't. Sarah stared at his outstretched hand, her mind racing. She could feel the weight of every eye in the room, could practically hear the collective intake of breath as people waited to see what would happen. Part of her wanted to run, to save herself from what was surely going to be an even greater humiliation, but another part of her, a part that had been buried under years of shame and self-doubt, stirred to life. She looked up at Joseph's face, searching for any sign of mockery or cruelty. Instead, she found only patience and quiet strength that seemed to emanate from somewhere deep within him. His eyes held hers steadily, and in that moment Sarah realized that this wasn't about pity or charity. This was about something else entirely. The teenage girls who had been mocking her fell silent, their expressions shifting from cruel amusement to confusion. The elderly woman beside her, Eleanor, smiled softly and nodded encouragingly. The entire room seemed to hold its breath. Sarah's hand trembled as she reached out, her fingers barely touching Joseph's palm. The moment their skin made contact, she felt something electric pass between them. Not romantic, but something deeper, more primal. A recognition of shared humanity, of mutual respect, of the courage it took to stand in the face of judgment. "I don't know how to dance," she whispered, her voice breaking. Joseph's lips curved in the slightest smile. When he spoke, his voice was deep and gentle, carrying the cadence of someone who chose his words carefully. "Dancing isn't about knowing how," he said quietly. "It's about feeling the music in your spirit." The drums grew louder, more insistent, and Sarah found herself being gently pulled toward the center of the circle. Her legs felt like water, her heart hammered against her ribs, and every instinct she had screamed at her to run. But Joseph's hand remained steady in hers, anchoring her, giving her strength. As they reached the edge of the dance area, Sarah could see the faces of the crowd more clearly. Some watched with open curiosity, others with barely concealed skepticism. The teenage girls looked stunned, as if they couldn't quite believe what they were witnessing. But Eleanor Crowfeather beamed with pride, and several of the elderly tribal members nodded approvingly. Joseph turned to face Sarah, his movements slow and deliberate. "Feel the earth beneath your feet," he said softly. "Feel the rhythm of the drums. They're not just making music, they're making heartbeats." Sarah closed her eyes, trying to block out the crowd, trying to focus on the deep, steady thrum of the drums. She could feel the vibrations through the soles of her feet, could sense the way the rhythm seemed to sync with her pulse. When she opened her eyes, Joseph was watching her with an expression of gentle encouragement. "Now," he said, beginning to move in a simple rocking motion. "Follow the beat. There's no right or wrong way. There's only your way." Sarah's first movement was barely perceptible, a slight sway that matched the rhythm of her own heartbeat more than the drums. Her eyes remained fixed on Joseph's face, using his steady presence as an anchor against the storm of anxiety, threatening to overwhelm her. The community center felt impossibly large around them, yet simultaneously claustrophobic, as if the walls were closing in with each passing second. "Breathe," Joseph whispered, his voice so low only she could hear it. "The earth is holding you up. Trust it." The simple instruction cut through her panic like a blade through silk. Sarah drew in a shaky breath, then another, feeling her lungs expand fully for what felt like the first time in hours. As she exhaled, some of the tension in her shoulders began to ease, and she found herself naturally shifting her weight from one foot to the other, in time with the drums. Around them, the crowd watched with a mixture of fascination and discomfort. This wasn't the typical powwow narrative, the graceful athletic dancers spinning and leaping in elaborate regalia. Instead, they were witnessing something rawer, more vulnerable. A woman who had been mocked for her size was now moving with quiet dignity in the sacred circle, guided by one of their most respected young dancers. "That's it," Joseph murmured encouragingly. "You're not performing for them. You're talking to the spirits of your ancestors, telling them who you are." Sarah's movements grew slightly more confident, though she kept them small and controlled. She had spent so many years trying to minimize her presence, to take up as little space as possible, that the idea of moving freely felt foreign and terrifying. But there was something about the steady thrum of the drums, the way they seemed to vibrate through her bones, that made her feel grounded in a way she hadn't experienced in years. Margaret Whitehorse, the elderly woman who organized the powwow, leaned forward in her chair, her weathered hands gripping her walking stick. At 78, she had seen thousands of dances, had participated in countless ceremonies, but there was something about this moment that felt different, sacred even. "Look at that," she whispered to her neighbor, Emma Spotted Elk. "That boy understands something most people have forgotten." Emma nodded, her own eyes never leaving the pair in the center of the circle. "His grandmother raised him right. Eleanor always said Joseph had the gift of seeing people's spirits, not just their bodies." The drums shifted to a slightly faster rhythm, and Joseph adjusted his movements accordingly, his steps becoming more deliberate, while still maintaining the gentle, non-threatening pace he had established. Sarah followed his lead, her natural rhythm beginning to emerge despite her self-consciousness. "I can feel them staring," she said, her voice tight with anxiety. "They're not staring at you," Joseph replied, his tone matter-of-fact. "They're witnessing you. There's a difference." Sarah wasn't sure she understood the distinction, but something in his voice made her look up, meeting his eyes directly for the first time since they had begun moving. What she saw there surprised her. Not pity or charity, but genuine respect. He was looking at her the way she had always dreamed of being looked at, as a whole person, worthy of dignity and consideration. The realization hit her like a physical blow, and she stumbled slightly, her coordination faltering. Joseph's hand tightened around hers, steadying her without making her feel clumsy or inadequate. "I'm sorry," she began, but he shook his head. "Don't apologize for being human," he said firmly. "The dance isn't about perfection, it's about truth." Near the front of the crowd, the teenage girls who had been mocking Sarah earlier sat in stunned silence. Kayla Morrison, the ringleader of the group, felt an uncomfortable knot forming in her stomach as she watched the scene unfold. At 16, she had always been popular, athletic, the kind of girl who moved through the world with confidence and ease. But watching Sarah dance, really dance, not just go through the motions, made her feel small and cruel in a way that was entirely new. "Maybe we should go," whispered her friend Jessica, shifting uncomfortably in her seat. "Why?" Kayla asked, though her voice lacked its usual sharp edge. "Because we're being awful," Jessica replied quietly. "Look at her. She's actually beautiful when she dances." Kayla wanted to argue, to maintain the protective shell of superiority that had always defined her social identity. But as she watched Sarah move with increasing grace and confidence, guided by Joseph's patient instruction, she found herself unable to summon the familiar cruelty. Instead, she felt something she rarely experienced: shame. The drums began building to a crescendo, and Joseph's movements became more expansive, though he remained mindful of Sarah's comfort level. She was beginning to trust the rhythm now, her body finding its own interpretation of the music. Her steps were different from the traditional patterns, heavier, more grounded, but no less valid. "You're doing it," Joseph said, and for the first time, Sarah heard genuine surprise in his voice. "You're really doing it." Sarah felt a rush of something she couldn't quite name, pride maybe, or simple joy. For the first time in years, she was moving her body not to hide it or minimize it, but to express something true about herself, The drums seemed to be calling to a part of her that had been buried under years of shame and self-doubt, and she found herself responding with increasing boldness. Eleanor Crow Feather watched her grandson with tears in her eyes. She had raised Joseph from the age of 12, after his parents died in a car accident on the reservation's dangerous roads. She had watched him struggle with grief and anger, had seen him find healing through the traditional ways, but she had never seen him extend that same healing to someone else, with such natural grace and wisdom. "He's teaching her more than dance steps," Eleanor said to herself, though her words were overheard by Robert Standing Bear, who sat beside her. "Your grandson has a gift," Robert replied. "He sees what others miss." Eleanor nodded, remembering the day Joseph had first started dancing after his parents' death. He had been so angry, so lost, but the moment he stepped into the circle, something had changed. The dance had given him a way to express his grief, his love, his hope for the future. Now he was offering that same gift to a stranger. As the song reached its peak, Sarah found herself moving with a freedom she hadn't experienced since childhood. Her feet followed the rhythm without conscious thought. Her arms moved naturally at her sides, and for the first time in years, she forgot about the size of her body and simply existed in the moment. The crowd began to sense the shift. What had started as a spectacle, a large white woman being helped to dance by a young native man, had transformed into something deeper. They were witnessing not just a dance, but a moment of genuine human connection, a bridge being built between two very different worlds. Joseph, sensing Sarah's growing confidence, began to incorporate more traditional elements into their shared movement. He showed her how to honor the four directions, how to move in a way that acknowledged the earth beneath their feet and the sky above their heads. Sarah followed his lead, her movements becoming more purposeful and ceremonial. "I feel different," she said, her voice filled with wonder. "You're the same person you were 10 minutes ago," Joseph replied. "You're just remembering who that person is." As the drums began to wind down, signaling the end of the song, Sarah felt a profound sense of loss. She didn't want the moment to end, didn't want to return to the world where she was defined by her weight and her perceived inadequacies. Here, in the circle, she was simply Sarah, a woman who could move with grace and dignity, who could connect with something larger than herself. The final drumbeat echoed through the community center, and the dancers gradually came to a stop. Joseph released Sarah's hand slowly, as if he too was reluctant to break the connection they had forged. Around them, the crowd began to stir, some clapping politely, others sitting in contemplative silence. Sarah looked around at the faces surrounding her, expecting to see mockery or judgment. Instead, she found something she hadn't anticipated: respect. The elderly tribal members nodded approvingly, the middle-aged women smiled warmly, and even some of the younger people looked at her with new eyes. Margaret Whitehorse stood up slowly, her walking stick tapping against the floor as she made her way toward the center of the circle. The crowd parted respectfully as she approached, and Sarah felt a flutter of nervousness as the elderly woman stopped directly in front of her. "Thank you," Margaret said simply, her voice carrying the weight of decades of wisdom. "You honored us today." Sarah stared at her in confusion. "I honored you. I don't understand." Margaret smiled, the lines around her eyes deepening. "You trusted us with your truth. That's the greatest gift anyone can give." As Margaret walked away, Sarah felt tears threatening to overwhelm her. She had come to the powwow as a journalist, expecting to observe and report on someone else's culture. Instead, she had been invited to participate, to share in something sacred and transformative. Joseph stood quietly beside her, his presence a steady comfort as she processed the intensity of the experience. Around them, the powwow was resuming its normal rhythm, but Sarah knew that something fundamental had shifted. She had danced in the sacred circle, had been accepted and honored by a community that had every reason to reject her. "What happens now?" she asked Joseph quietly. He smiled, the expression transforming his usually serious face. "Now you know what it feels like to be seen for who you really are. The question is, what are you going to do with that knowledge?" 3 days after the powwow, Sarah sat in her cramped apartment in Rapid City, staring at the blank document on her laptop screen. The cursor blinked mockingly, waiting for her to begin the article that was already 2 days overdue. Her editor, Tom Richardson, had called twice that morning, his voice growing increasingly impatient with each message. "Where's my powwow piece, Thompson? I need 800 words by Friday, and it's already Wednesday." 800 words. Sarah had written thousands of articles in her 5-year career, most of them flowing from her fingers with practiced ease. But this one felt different. How could she possibly capture what had happened in the community center? How could she reduce that profound moment of transformation into a neat, digestible piece for the morning paper? Her phone buzzed with a text from Marcus. "How's the article coming?" Mom called and asked about the powwow story. Sarah set the phone aside without responding. She hadn't told Marcus about dancing, hadn't mentioned Joseph, or the way Margaret Whitehorse had looked at her with such profound respect. The experience felt too sacred, too personal to share with anyone who hadn't been there. Instead, she had spent the last 3 days replaying every moment in her mind. The feel of Joseph's steady hand in hers, the sound of the drums vibrating through her bones, the way her body had moved with a grace she didn't know she possessed, and most importantly, the way the crowd's perception of her had shifted from mockery to something approaching reverence. The apartment felt stifling, filled with the detritus of a life lived in hiding. Takeout containers stacked on the coffee table, clothes in sizes that made her feel shame every time she looked at the tags, a refrigerator covered with diet plans and motivational quotes that had never motivated her to do anything except feel worse about herself. Sarah pushed back from the desk and walked to the mirror, hanging on her bedroom wall. For years she had avoided looking at herself directly, instead catching glimpses in storefront windows or car mirrors, fragments of her reflection that never told the whole story. But now, for the first time in memory, she studied her face with curious eyes. The woman looking back at her was still large, still carried the weight that had defined her for so many years, but there was something different in her expression, a clarity that hadn't been there before. Her eyes held a confidence that was foreign, yet familiar, as if she was remembering something she had forgotten long ago. Her phone rang, startling her from her reverie. The caller ID showed a number she didn't recognize, but the area code was local. "Hello? Sarah Thompson. This is Eleanor Crow-Feather. We met at the powwow on Sunday." Sarah's heart skipped. "Mrs. Crow-Feather, yes. How did you get my number?" "I called the newspaper. I hope you don't mind, but I wanted to invite you to dinner tomorrow night. Joseph will be there, and I thought you might like to learn more about our traditions for your article." Sarah found herself accepting before she had time to think about it. After hanging up, she realized she had committed to something that terrified her almost as much as dancing had. Dinner with strangers, in an environment where she would be even more obviously out of place than she had been at the powwow. The next evening, Sarah drove through the winding roads of Pine Ridge, her GPS struggling to find the turnoff to Eleanor's house. The October sun was setting early, painting the sky in shades of gold and crimson that seemed to set the entire landscape on fire. She had changed clothes 3 times, finally settling on a simple black dress that she hoped was respectful without being too formal. Eleanor's house was a modest ranch-style building with a wraparound porch and a garden that even in late fall showed signs of careful tending. Wind chimes hung from the eaves, creating a gentle melody that blended with the sound of the evening breeze. As Sarah approached the front door, she could smell something delicious cooking inside, something that made her stomach growl despite her nervousness. Joseph answered the door, and Sarah was struck again by his quiet presence. He wore jeans and a simple button-down shirt, his long hair pulled back in a ponytail, but there was something about his bearing that suggested he would look equally comfortable in traditional regalia or a business suit. "Sarah," he said, his voice warm with genuine welcome. "Grandmother is very excited to meet you properly." The interior of the house was cozy and lived in, with photographs covering every available surface. Sarah found herself drawn to the images, generations of crow feathers in various stages of life, from sepia-toned portraits of stern-faced ancestors to color snapshots of children playing in the yard. The walls were decorated with native artwork, star quilts, and what appeared to be certificates and awards earned by various family members. "Those are Joseph's academic honors," Eleanor said, appearing from the kitchen with a dish towel in her hands. "He graduated from the University of South Dakota with a degree in social work. Now he counsels at-risk youth on the reservation." Sarah looked at the certificates with new interest. Joseph had clearly excelled academically, but she wondered what had drawn him back to the reservation instead of pursuing opportunities in larger cities. "I couldn't leave," Joseph said, as if reading her thoughts. "This is where I'm needed, where I belong." Dinner was a revelation. Eleanor had prepared traditional foods alongside more familiar dishes: wild rice, venison stew, fry bread, and roasted vegetables from her garden. As they ate, Eleanor shared stories about the history of the Lakota people, the challenges they faced, and the ways they were working to preserve their culture for future generations. People think we're stuck in the past, Eleanor said, passing Sarah another helping of wild rice. But tradition isn't about living in the past. It's about carrying the wisdom of our ancestors forward into the future. Sarah found herself opening up in ways she rarely did, even with close friends. She talked about her work as a journalist, her fascination with Native American history, and her struggle to find her place in a world that seemed to have very specific ideas about what bodies were acceptable and what stories were worth telling. "I've always felt like I was on the outside looking in," she admitted, "like I was taking up space that belonged to someone else." Joseph set down his fork and looked at her directly. "At the powwow, when you danced, you weren't taking up space. You were filling the space that was always meant for you." The words hit Sarah like a physical blow. She had spent so many years trying to minimize herself, to disappear, that the idea of having a space that was meant for her felt almost incomprehensible. "I don't understand," she said quietly. Eleanor reached across the table and covered Sarah's hand with her own. "In our tradition, we believe that every person has a purpose, a reason for being here. Your size, your struggles, your gifts, they're all part of that purpose. The tragedy isn't that you're different. The tragedy is that you've been taught to see your difference as a flaw." After dinner, Joseph offered to show Sarah the family's sweat lodge, a small dome-shaped structure in the backyard that had been used for ceremonies for generations. As they walked through the evening air, Sarah found herself more relaxed than she had been in years. "Can I ask you something?" she said as they stood beside the sacred structure. "Of course. Why did you ask me to dance? You could have just let those girls say what they wanted to say. You could have ignored the whole thing." Joseph was quiet for a long moment, his eyes fixed on the darkening sky. "My parents died when I was 12, he said finally. "For a long time after that, I was angry. I felt like the world was telling me I didn't matter, that my pain wasn't important because I was just another Indian kid from the reservation." Sarah listened in silence, sensing that he was sharing something deeply personal. "The first time I danced after they died, I was scared. I felt like everyone was watching me, judging me, waiting for me to fail. But my grandmother brought me to the center of the circle, and she said something I'll never forget. The dance doesn't care about your fear. It only cares about your truth." He turned to face Sarah, his expression earnest. "When I saw you in that community center, I saw someone who was afraid to share her truth, and I remembered what it felt like to be in that place." Sarah felt tears threatening again. "I'm not sure I know what my truth is anymore." "That's okay," Joseph said gently. "Truth isn't something you figure out all at once. It's something you discover, one step at a time." As they walked back toward the house, Sarah realized that something fundamental had shifted in her understanding of herself. For the first time, she was beginning to see her struggles not as personal failures, but as part of a larger story, one that connected her to other people who had also felt marginalized and invisible. Eleanor was waiting for them on the porch, a thermos of coffee in her hands. "I have something for you," she said to Sarah, disappearing into the house briefly before returning with a small bundle wrapped in soft deerskin. "What is this?" Sarah asked, accepting the gift with trembling hands. "Open it," Eleanor encouraged. Inside the wrapping was a small piece of sage and a delicate silver bracelet with a single turquoise stone. The craftsmanship was exquisite, clearly handmade with great care and attention to detail. "I made this for you," Eleanor said simply. "The sage is for cleansing, for letting go of the things that no longer serve you. The bracelet is to remind you that you have a place in this world, that you are valued and seen." Sarah stared at the gifts, overwhelmed by the generosity of these people who barely knew her. "I don't know what to say." "You don't have to say anything," Eleanor replied. "Just remember that you danced in our circle, and that makes you family." As Sarah drove home that night, the sage and bracelet carefully placed on her passenger seat, she felt something she hadn't experienced in years: hope. Not the desperate, grasping hope of someone trying to change themselves into someone else, but the quiet, steady hope of someone beginning to accept who they already were. The article was still waiting, the cursor still blinking on her laptop screen, but for the first time Sarah thought she might know what to write. Sarah's article appeared in the Rapid City Journal on a crisp Friday morning in November, occupying the entire front page of the lifestyle section. The headline read, "Finding Grace, When Community Transcends Judgment at Pine Ridge Powwow." Instead of the 800 words Tom Richardson had requested, Sarah had written nearly 2,000, and to her surprise, he had run the piece in its entirety. She sat in her apartment, clutching her morning coffee with trembling hands as she read her own words in print. The article was unlike anything she had written before, deeply personal, vulnerable and honest about her own experience, while maintaining respect for the Lakota traditions she had witnessed. I went to Pine Ridge as a journalist, expecting to observe and report on someone else's culture. Instead, I was invited to participate in something sacred and transformative. When the drums began, and a young Lakota man extended his hand to me, a woman who had just been mocked for her size, I learned that grace isn't about perfection, it's about courage. Her phone had been ringing constantly since the newspaper hit the stands. The first call came from her mother in Minneapolis, her voice thick with emotion. "Honey, I had no idea you were struggling so much. Why didn't you tell me?" "I didn't know how," Sarah admitted, curling up on her couch. "I didn't even know I was struggling until I stopped." The conversation with her mother lasted nearly an hour, the longest they had talked in years. For the first time, Sarah found herself able to articulate the weight she had carried, not just physical but emotional and spiritual. By noon, her editor Tom was calling with news that both thrilled and terrified her. "The phones haven't stopped ringing," he said, his voice excited. "The Denver Post wants to pick up the story. People magazine called. There's a producer from a morning show who wants to talk to you." Sarah felt her chest tighten. "I don't want to be a story, Tom. I just wanted to write about what happened." "Too late for that," he said, though not unkindly. "You've struck a nerve. This is about more than just a powwow, and you know it." He was right. The article had tapped into something deeper, the universal human need to belong, to be seen and accepted for who we truly are. But the attention felt overwhelming, threatening to turn her personal transformation into a public spectacle. Her phone buzzed with a text from Joseph. "Read the article. Grandmother wants to know if you're okay." Sarah realized she hadn't thought about how the publication might affect the Crow-Feather family. She had changed their names in the article, but anyone familiar with Pine Ridge would know who they were. Had she violated their privacy? Had she exploited their kindness for her own professional gain? She called Joseph immediately, her heart pounding as she waited for him to answer. "Sarah," his voice was calm, reassuring. "Are you all right? You sound upset." "I'm worried I've made a mistake," she said, pacing around her small living room. "I didn't think about how this would affect your family. If I've brought unwanted attention—" "Stop," Joseph said firmly. "Come to dinner on Sunday. We need to talk, but not over the phone." The days between the article's publication and Sunday dinner passed in a blur of phone calls, emails, and interview requests. Sarah found herself at the center of a media storm that felt completely surreal. Strangers on the street recognized her, some offering words of support, others staring with the same mixture of curiosity and judgment she had experienced her entire life. A local news station wanted to do a follow-up segment. A documentary filmmaker called about exploring her story. The most unsettling call came from a talent agent in Los Angeles who wanted to discuss opportunities in the inspirational speaking circuit. "You could be the next big thing in body positivity," the agent said, her voice slick with professional enthusiasm. "I see book deals, speaking engagements, maybe even a movie option." Sarah hung up, feeling nauseated. The idea of turning her experience into a commodity, of becoming a professional inspiration, felt like a betrayal of everything that had happened in that sacred circle. When Sunday arrived, Sarah drove to Pine Ridge with a heavy heart. The landscape looked different in November, starker, more austere, but no less beautiful. The leaves had fallen, leaving the trees stark against the gray sky, and there was a quality to the light that made everything seem more real, more immediate. Eleanor's house was warm and welcoming as always, but Sarah could sense a different energy as she walked through the door. Joseph was there, along with several other family members she hadn't met, his uncle Robert, his cousin Maria, and Maria's teenage daughter Emma. "Sit," Eleanor said, gesturing to the familiar chair at the dining table. "We have things to discuss." The conversation that followed was unlike any Sarah had experienced. Instead of anger or accusation, the family offered her something she hadn't expected: perspective. "The article is beautiful," Maria said, her voice thoughtful, "but it's also brought attention we didn't anticipate. Reporters have been calling, asking about Joseph, about our family, about the powwow." Sarah felt her face flush with shame. "I'm so sorry. I should have thought..." "Should have thought what?" Robert interrupted, his voice gentle but firm. "That we're too fragile to handle attention? That our stories aren't worth telling?" "That's not what I meant," Sarah said, struggling to articulate her concerns. "We know what you meant," Eleanor said, settling into her chair with a cup of tea. "You're worried that you've exploited us, That you've taken our kindness and turned it into something for your own benefit. Sarah nodded, tears threatening. But that's not what happened, Joseph said, speaking for the first time since she had arrived. You told the truth. You honored what we shared with you. The fact that other people are responding to that truth, that's not exploitation. That's the story doing what stories are supposed to do. Emma, who had been quietly listening, suddenly spoke up. I read your article for my English class, she said, her voice barely above a whisper. I wrote a paper about it. What did you write? Sarah asked. About how brave you were, Emma replied, her eyes meeting Sarah's directly. About how you danced even though you were scared. About how Uncle Joseph saw your spirit instead of just your body. The simple words from the teenager hit Sarah harder than any of the professional accolades she had received. This was why she had written the article, not for fame or career advancement, but to share something true about the human experience. There's something else, Eleanor said, reaching into a basket beside her chair. We've been getting letters. She pulled out a thick stack of envelopes, letters that had been forwarded from the newspaper. People have been writing to us, to you, to the paper. They want to share their own stories. Sarah looked at the letters with amazement. What do they say? Read for yourself, Eleanor said, handing her one of the envelopes. The letter was from a woman in Phoenix, written in careful handwriting on floral stationery. Dear Sarah and the Crowfeather family, I read your article 3 times and cried each time. I am a 45-year-old woman who has never danced in public because I was told I was too awkward, too clumsy, too embarrassing. But after reading your story, I signed up for a dance class. I wanted you to know that your courage gave me courage. Thank you for showing me that grace isn't about perfection. Sarah read letter after letter, each one sharing a similar story of someone who had felt marginalized, invisible, or ashamed, but who had found inspiration in her experience. A man who had been afraid to sing in church because of his stutter. A teenager who had stopped playing sports because of her height. An elderly woman who had given up painting because her arthritis made her hands shake. This is what I meant, Joseph said quietly. The story is doing what it's supposed to do. It's helping people remember who they are. But what about the media attention? Sarah asked. What about the reporters and the documentary people? We'll handle that together, Eleanor said firmly. If you want to tell more of the story, we'll help you tell it right. If you want to step back, we'll respect that too. But don't let fear of being misunderstood stop you from sharing what's true. As the evening progressed, Sarah found herself part of a planning session. The family had decided to organize a special powwow in the spring, one focused on inclusion and healing. They wanted to invite some of the people who had written letters to create a space where everyone could experience what Sarah had experienced. We're calling it the Circle of Grace Powwow, Maria explained. It would be about opening our traditions to people who need healing, who need to remember their own worth. And we want you to help us organize it, Joseph added. Not as a journalist, but as a member of the community. Sarah stared at them in amazement. You want me to be part of the community? You already are, Eleanor said simply. You danced in our circle. You told our story with respect and truth. You're family now, whether you like it or not. As Sarah drove home that night, the letters carefully placed in a box on her passenger seat, she felt a sense of purpose she had never experienced before. The media attention still made her uncomfortable, but she was beginning to understand that her story was bigger than her personal comfort. She had a choice to make. She could retreat back into the safety of anonymity, or she could step forward into the unknown territory of being someone who spoke for others, who felt voiceless. The next morning, she called the documentary filmmaker back. I'll do the interview, she said, but I have conditions. The documentary crew arrived at Pine Ridge on a bitterly cold December morning, their equipment vans looking starkly out of place against the wind-swept landscape. Sarah stood beside Joseph outside the community center, watching the technicians set up their cameras and lighting equipment, and felt her anxiety spike to levels she hadn't experienced since the night of the powwow. You don't have to do this, Joseph said quietly, his breath visible in the frigid air. You can still change your mind. Sarah wrapped her coat tighter around herself, feeling the weight of the turquoise bracelet Eleanor had given her pressing against her wrist. I know, but I keep thinking about those letters, about that woman in Phoenix who's taking dance classes now. If telling this story helps even one person, then it's worth it, Joseph finished. But remember, you control the narrative. Don't let them make you into something you're not. The documentary filmmaker, Rebecca Martinez, was a slight woman in her 30s, with intense dark eyes and an energy that seemed to vibrate through the cold air. She had flown in from San Francisco with her small crew, explaining that she wanted to create a film about authentic stories of transformation and community healing. "I'm not interested in inspiration porn," Rebecca had told Sarah during their initial phone conversation. "I want to explore the real complexities of what happened to you, what it means for Indigenous communities, and how genuine cultural exchange can happen respectfully." Now standing in the same space where Sarah had first danced, Rebecca's approach felt more intrusive than Sarah had anticipated. The filmmaker wanted to recreate the scene, to have Sarah and Joseph demonstrate their dance for the camera. "It won't be the same," Sarah protested, feeling exposed under the harsh television lights. "The ceremony, the context, the spontaneity, you can't recreate that." "We're not trying to recreate it," Rebecca explained patiently. "We're trying to help people understand what it meant to you. Sometimes showing is more powerful than telling." Eleanor, who had been watching the proceedings with a mixture of curiosity and concern, approached the group. "In our tradition," she said, her voice carrying the authority of her years, "some things are sacred and not meant to be performed for cameras." The dance Sarah experienced was a moment of healing, of connection. To perform it again would be to diminish its power. Rebecca's expression shifted, becoming more respectful. "I understand. Then let's focus on the aftermath, on the impact. Sarah, can you walk me through what happened after the dance ended?" The interview that followed was more intense than Sarah had expected. Rebecca's questions probed deep into her childhood, her relationship with her body, her struggles with self-acceptance. The filmmaker wanted to understand not just what had happened at the powwow, but what had led Sarah to that moment of vulnerability. "Tell me about the mockery," Rebecca said, her camera operator capturing every micro-expression on Sarah's face. "What did it feel like when those teenagers were laughing at you?" Sarah felt her throat tighten as she revisited that moment. "It felt like every cruel comment I'd ever received, every time I'd been made to feel like I didn't belong, was being validated. Like they were saying out loud what everyone else was thinking." "And when Joseph approached you?" "I thought he was going to humiliate me further," Sarah admitted. "I couldn't understand why someone would want to help me, especially in front of all those people." Joseph, who was sitting just outside the camera's view, shifted uncomfortably. During a break in filming, he pulled Sarah aside. "This feels wrong," he said, his voice tight with concern. "They're turning what happened into entertainment." "But that's not what Rebecca is doing," Sarah protested, though she was beginning to share his unease. "She's trying to tell an authentic story." "Whose authentic story?" Joseph asked. "Yours? Mine? The community's? Because right now it feels like she's extracting something from us rather than sharing something with us." The conversation was interrupted by Rebecca's assistant, who informed them that the filmmaker wanted to interview some of the community members who had been present at the original powwow. Sarah watched as Rebecca approached Margaret Whitehorse, the elderly woman who had organized the event. "I'd like to get your perspective on what happened," Rebecca said, her voice respectful but persistent. "How did it feel to see a non-native person participating in your ceremony?" Margaret's response was measured but firm. "Our ceremonies are about healing, about bringing people together. What happened with Sarah was natural, organic. But talking about it like this, analyzing it for cameras, this changes its nature. But surely you can see the value in sharing this story with a wider audience," Rebecca pressed. "I can see the value," Margaret replied, "but I also see the danger. When you take a sacred moment and make it into content, you risk losing what made it sacred in the first place." That evening, Sarah found herself in Eleanor's kitchen, helping prepare dinner while Joseph split wood outside. The normalcy of the domestic scene felt surreal after the intensity of the day's filming. "How do you think it went?" Sarah asked, chopping vegetables with more force than necessary. Eleanor paused in her stirring, considering the question carefully. "I think that young woman means well," she said finally. "But good intentions don't always lead to good outcomes." "What do you mean?" "She's trying to understand our world through her lens," Eleanor explained. "But some things can't be understood that way. They can only be experienced." Through the window, Sarah could see Joseph working in the growing darkness, his movements rhythmic and purposeful. Something about the scene reminded her of that first night at the powwow, the way he had moved with such quiet confidence and strength. "Can I ask you something?" Sarah said, setting down her knife. "What did Joseph see in me that night? Why did he choose to help me?" Eleanor smiled, the expression softening her weathered features. "He saw someone who needed to remember who they were. Joseph has always been able to see past the surface, to recognize the spirit underneath. But there were other people there who might have needed help too." "True," Eleanor agreed. "But you were the one who was ready to receive it. Sometimes the universe puts people in our path not because they're the most deserving, but because they're the most ready. The next morning brought new challenges. Rebecca wanted to film Sarah and Joseph in various locations around the reservation, creating what she called a visual narrative of their connection. The request made Sarah deeply uncomfortable, particularly when the filmmaker suggested they visit the sweat lodge where Joseph had shared his story about his parents' death. "That's not appropriate," Joseph said firmly. "That's a sacred space, not a film set." "I'm not asking you to perform a ceremony," Rebecca said. "I just want to capture the environment, the context of your conversation." "The context was trust," Joseph replied. "You can't capture that with a camera." The tension between the filmmaker's vision and the family's boundaries continued to escalate throughout the day. Rebecca seemed frustrated by what she perceived as resistance to her artistic vision, while the Crow-Feather family grew increasingly protective of their sacred spaces and traditions. The breaking point came when Rebecca asked to film inside the community center during a regular family gathering, wanting to show authentic reservation life. Joseph's uncle Robert, who had been quiet throughout most of the filming, finally spoke up. "This isn't authentic," he said, his voice carrying decades of frustration. "You're asking us to perform our lives for your cameras. That's not how we live when no one's watching." "I'm trying to show the world that Native communities are vibrant and complex," Rebecca protested. "That you're not just historical artifacts. By turning us into content," Robert shot back, "by editing our words and our lives to fit your narrative?" Sarah watched the exchange with growing horror. She had agreed to the documentary because she wanted to share a story of healing and acceptance, but it was becoming clear that the process itself was creating division and pain. That night, she made a decision that surprised everyone, including herself. "I'm pulling out of the documentary," she announced as the family gathered for dinner. "What?" Rebecca said, her face pale with shock. "Sarah, we have a contract. We've already invested." "I don't care about the contract," Sarah said, her voice steadier than she felt. "This isn't the story I wanted to tell. You're making us into characters in your narrative instead of letting us tell our own story." "But think about the platform this gives you," Rebecca argued. "The reach, the impact you could have." "What impact?" Sarah asked. "Teaching people that it's okay to turn other people's sacred moments into entertainment. That cultural exchange means extracting stories from communities for outside consumption." Joseph reached across the table and took her hand, the gesture simple but powerful. "I'm proud of you," he said quietly. Eleanor nodded approvingly. Sometimes the most important story is the one you choose not to tell. As Rebecca and her crew packed up their equipment the next morning, Sarah felt a mixture of relief and uncertainty. She had given up what could have been a significant career opportunity, but she had also preserved something more valuable, the integrity of her experience and the trust of her new family. "What now?" Joseph asked as they watched the vans disappear down the dusty road. "Now we plan the Circle of Grace powwow," Sarah said, feeling a sense of purpose that had nothing to do with cameras or contracts. "We tell the story the way it should be told, by living it." 6 months later, on a warm May afternoon, Sarah stood at the edge of the same community center where her journey had begun, watching as families from across the country arrived for the first annual Circle of Grace powwow. The parking lot was filled with cars bearing license plates from Arizona, Colorado, Texas, and as far away as Maine. She wore a simple blue dress that Eleanor had helped her choose, and around her wrist, the turquoise bracelet caught the late afternoon sunlight. "Are you ready for this?" Joseph asked, appearing beside her with 2 cups of coffee. He had been working for weeks to prepare for the event, coordinating with tribal elders, arranging for traditional foods, and ensuring that every detail honored both Lakota traditions and the inclusive spirit they wanted to create. "I don't think anyone could be ready for this," Sarah replied, accepting the coffee gratefully. "Look at all these people." The crowd was unlike any powwow Sarah had attended. Alongside the expected Native American families were people of all ages, sizes, and backgrounds, many of whom had written letters after reading her article. There was Linda, the woman from Phoenix who had started taking dance classes. Marcus, a military veteran from Denver who had been afraid to sing in public since his injury. Elena, a teenager from Los Angeles who had stopped playing basketball because of her height. "They're all here because of you," Joseph said, his voice filled with quiet pride. "No," Sarah corrected, watching as Eleanor greeted a family with obvious warmth. "They're here because of all of us, because we decided to create something together instead of just talking about it." The months since the documentary incident had been transformative in ways Sarah never could have anticipated. Instead of pursuing media opportunities, She had thrown herself into helping plan the Circle of Grace powwow, working closely with the Crow Feather family and other tribal elders to ensure the event would be both authentic and inclusive. The process had taught her more about Lakota culture than any article or documentary could have conveyed. She had learned to prepare traditional foods, had helped create prayer ties for the ceremony, and had even been invited to participate in a women's talking circle where she had shared her own story of healing and growth. 5 minutes until we begin, called Margaret Whitehorse, now 89, and moving more slowly but still possessing the same commanding presence Sarah remembered from that first night. The opening ceremony was simple but powerful. Margaret welcomed everyone in both English and Lakota, explaining the significance of the powwow and the importance of approaching the sacred space with respect and open hearts. She then invited Eleanor to speak about the vision behind the Circle of Grace. "We created this gathering," Eleanor said, her voice carrying easily across the crowd, "because we believe that healing is not something that happens to us individually, but something that happens through us in community. Today, we invite you to step into the circle not as strangers but as relatives." The first dance was led by Joseph and several other traditional dancers, their movements flowing with the ancient rhythms that had been passed down through generations. Sarah watched from the sidelines, feeling the familiar stirring in her chest as the drums began their hypnotic beat. When the exhibition dance ended, Margaret stood once again. "Now," she said, her voice warm with invitation, "we open the circle to all who wish to dance. There is no right way or wrong way. There is only your way." What happened next was unlike anything Sarah had experienced in her months of attending powwows. Instead of the usual formal presentations by skilled dancers, the circle filled with people of all ages and abilities, each finding their own interpretation of the music's call. Linda from Phoenix stepped forward first, her movements tentative, but growing more confident with each beat. Marcus, the veteran, joined her, his scarred hands moving in gestures that seemed to tell the story of his journey home from war. Eleanor, the tall teenager, danced with a grace that seemed to embrace rather than hide her height. "Go," Joseph whispered in Sarah's ear. "Your story started this. You should be part of it. You." Sarah felt the familiar flutter of anxiety, but this time it was mixed with something else, anticipation. She had danced in this circle before, but that had been about personal healing. This was about something larger, about the community they had built together. As she stepped into the circle, Sarah noticed the faces around her. Some were familiar, people she had met during the planning months. Others were strangers who had traveled hundreds of miles to be here, but all of them looked at her with the same expression she had seen on Joseph's face that first night: recognition and respect. The music seemed to flow through her differently now. 6 months ago, she had danced in fear and desperation, reaching for something she couldn't name. Now she danced in gratitude and connection, her movements expressing not just her own journey, but the shared experience of everyone in the circle. Around her, the other dancers moved with their own stories. An elderly man with a walker modified his steps to accommodate his mobility, his dignity intact, and his joy evident. A mother danced while holding her infant, sharing the rhythm with the next generation. A group of teenagers who had driven from Chicago moved together, their urban style blending seamlessly with the traditional beat. As the song built to its climax, Sarah found herself moving closer to the center of the circle, her earlier fears replaced by a sense of belonging that felt as natural as breathing. She caught Joseph's eye across the circle, and he smiled with such warmth that she felt tears of joy threatening to overwhelm her. When the drums finally stopped, the silence that followed was profound. Then, slowly, the applause began, not the polite clapping of an audience, but the heartfelt appreciation of a community celebrating itself. "That was beautiful," said a voice behind Sarah. She turned to find a woman about her own age, her face glowing with the same post-dance euphoria Sarah remembered from her first experience. "I'm Rebecca," the woman continued. "I drove here from Kansas City. I've never danced before, but your article, it gave me the courage to try." Similar conversations were happening throughout the crowd. People were sharing their stories, their fears, their moments of triumph. Sarah realized that what she had experienced as a deeply personal transformation had become something much larger, a movement of people choosing vulnerability over safety, connection over isolation. As the afternoon progressed, the powwow took on a life of its own. The traditional dances were interspersed with moments of spontaneous celebration, with children teaching adults their own interpretations of the music. with elders sharing stories that connected the past to the present. Joseph found Sarah during a break between dances, his face serious despite the joy surrounding them. "I need to tell you something," he said, leading her to a quiet corner of the community center. Sarah's heart skipped, wondering if something was wrong. "I've been offered a job," he continued. "The National Congress of American Indians wants me to develop a program based on what we've created here. They want to replicate the Circle of Grace model in other communities." "That's wonderful," Sarah said, though she felt a stab of loss at the thought of Joseph leaving Pine Ridge. "It would mean traveling, being away from the reservation for months at a time," he said. "But they also want a co-director, someone who understands both the cultural components and the media aspects." Sarah stared at him, not quite understanding what he was suggesting. "They want you, Sarah. They want us to do this together." The offer was overwhelming and terrifying and perfect all at once. Sarah thought about her life in Rapid City, her apartment filled with takeout containers and diet plans. Then she thought about the letters that still arrived regularly, the people who had driven hundreds of miles to be here today, the sense of purpose that had filled her life since that first night at the powwow. "Are you asking me to work with you?" she said finally. "I'm asking you to build something with me," Joseph replied. "Something that honors what we've learned and shares it with people who need it." Before Sarah could respond, Eleanor appeared beside them, her face knowingly amused. "Are you two going to stand here talking all day, or are you going to dance?" she asked. "The final circle is about to begin." The closing ceremony was a grand dance that included everyone present, dancers and observers, traditionalists and newcomers, young and old. As the circle formed, Sarah found herself between Joseph and Linda from Phoenix, part of a chain of humanity that stretched around the entire gymnasium. The final song was slow and contemplative, a prayer in musical form. As they moved together, Sarah felt the weight of the journey that had brought her here. From that first night of humiliation and fear to this moment of profound connection and possibility, she looked around the circle at the faces of people who had found the courage to be seen, to be vulnerable, to claim their place in the world. She thought about the letters still arriving, the communities still waiting to hear that they too had value, they too deserved to dance. When the last drumbeat faded, the circle held for a moment in perfect silence. Then, as if responding to some invisible signal, everyone began to move toward the center, creating a tight cluster of embracing humanity. In that moment, Sarah understood what Joseph had meant about stories doing what they were supposed to do. Her story had become their story had become a movement, and the movement had become a circle of grace that would continue to expand long after this single day had ended. Later, as the community center emptied and the last families loaded into their cars for the journey home, Sarah stood with Joseph and Eleanor in the parking lot, watching the sunset paint the sky in shades of gold and crimson. "So," Eleanor said, her voice rich with satisfaction, "what's next?" Sarah looked at Joseph, then at the empty community center where so much transformation had taken place, then at the letters in her car that represented communities across the country waiting for their own circle of grace. "Next," she said, her voice strong with certainty, "we make the circle bigger.